Your great-great-grandma knew things your oven never will, because some cooking tricks don't just last decades, they survive centuries. From fire-roasted magic to preservation methods born out of pure necessity, these traditions fed empires, villages, and families alike. Before industrial mills took over, turning grains into flour was a labor-intensive process. But for thousands of years, civilizations from Egypt to the American frontier relied on a simple, time-tested method: stone grinding for flour. By crushing grains between large, heavy stones, they produced flour with all the fiber, nutrients, and natural oils intact. Unlike today's refined white flour, which strips away much of the grain's goodness, traditional stone-ground flour retained its full nutritional value. Even the Mayans and Aztecs used volcanic stones to grind maize for tortillas, a tradition still practiced in parts of Mexico today. And it wasn't just about survival. Stone-ground grains had richer flavor, deeper aroma, and a hearty texture that modern milling often fails to replicate. Although industrial roller mills nearly replaced this technique by the late 19th century, stone grinding never fully disappeared. Today, health-conscious bakers, homesteaders, and artisanal bread makers are bringing it back. Freshly ground grains have a shorter shelf life, but they're also packed with nutrients, making them a favorite in organic and whole food circles. The movement towards self-sufficiency has also played a role as more people seek control over their food sources. Long before grocery store yeast became the standard, bakers across the world relied on a simpler, more natural process: sourdough bread making. This ancient method dates back over 5,000 years, with evidence of fermented bread found in Egyptian ruins. Unlike modern bread, which rises with the help of commercial yeast, sourdough depends on wild yeast and bacteria from the environment. The result? A slow fermentation process that not only gives sourdough its signature tang, but also makes it easier to digest. In regions where commercial yeast didn't exist, communities passed down sourdough starters like family heirlooms, feeding and maintaining them for generations. San Francisco, now famous for its sourdough, owes much of its tradition to Gold Rush-era miners who carried their sourdough starters through rough terrain, ensuring they always had a way to make bread. In modern kitchens, sourdough has made a resurgence, not just for its rich flavor but for its health benefits. With rising interest in self-sufficiency and traditional foods, home bakers are once again keeping sourdough starters alive, sometimes quite literally, with names and all. There's a reason cast iron cooking has never gone out of style. This kitchen workhorse dates back over 2,000 years, with early versions found in China before making their way across Europe and into American pioneer kitchens. Unlike modern non-stick pans that wear out, a well-seasoned cast iron skillet only gets better with time. Some families still use pans that are over a century old, proving that when properly cared for, cast iron is practically indestructible. In colonial America, cast iron cookware was so valuable that it was included in wills. Its ability to retain heat evenly made it essential for cooking everything from cornbread to stews over open flames. Fast forward to today, and you'll still find them in southern kitchens, where dishes like skillet-fried chicken hold a deep cultural connection. While stainless steel and aluminum have taken over modern cookware aisles, cast iron has seen a revival, especially among those looking to reduce reliance on disposable, chemical-laden alternatives. Unlike synthetic coated pans, cast iron develops a natural non-stick surface over time, no Teflon required. And when it comes to sustainability, this is cookware you buy once and never replace. Long before stovetops, ovens, and air fryers, humans mastered the art of open-fire cooking. From prehistoric times to modern-day campfires, cooking over an open flame has remained one of the most reliable and flavorful ways to prepare food. Fire transformed raw ingredients, unlocking deeper flavors and making food easier to digest. Ancient civilizations, from the Greeks to indigenous tribes across the Americas, developed techniques for roasting, smoking, and slow-cooking meats over hot coals. The spit-roasted meats of medieval Europe fed entire villages, while Argentinian asado and Texas barbecue still celebrate fire as a culinary art form. Even the classic American backyard cookout is a direct descendant of these ancient traditions. There's a reason we still crave flame-kissed steaks and smoky, charred vegetables. Fire adds something no kitchen appliance can replicate. While most people today rely on gas and electricity, open fire cooking is making a comeback, especially among homesteaders, outdoor enthusiasts, and chefs who appreciate its primal simplicity. Whether it's wood-fired pizza, cast-iron cowboy beans, or a simple roasted marshmallow, cooking with fire connects us to something ancient. Long before metal cookware dominated kitchens, civilizations across the world relied on a more natural material: clay pot cooking. Archaeological evidence shows that humans have been using clay vessels for over 10,000 years, with early examples found in ancient Mesopotamia, China, and South America. The secret to their longevity? Clay distributes heat slowly and evenly, making it perfect for slow-cooked stews, braised meats, and tender grains like India's beloved biryani. Unlike metal, clay pots retain moisture, locking in flavor and preventing food from drying out. It's no wonder this method has remained a staple in cultures worldwide. From North African tagines to the earthenware pots of Mexico, cooking in clay isn't just about tradition. It enhances taste and texture in a way modern cookware often fails to replicate. While mass-produced non-stick pans have replaced clay in many households, this ancient technique hasn't disappeared. In fact, it's making a resurgence among health-conscious cooks and sustainability advocates. Clay is naturally non-toxic, free of synthetic coatings, and when properly maintained, can last for generations. Before refrigeration, when food preservation meant the difference between survival and starvation, drying meat was one of the most effective ways to make it last, giving us jerky. From the sun-dried strips of ancient Egypt to the smoked bison of Native American tribes, nearly every civilization had its own version of this protein-packed survival food. Incan warriors carried charqui, a salted, dried meat that inspired the modern word jerky, on long journeys, ensuring they had sustenance without the risk of spoilage. What made jerky so valuable? Removing moisture prevented bacteria from growing, allowing meat to be stored for months or even years. For pioneers crossing the American frontier, a pouch of dried venison or beef was as essential as a sturdy wagon wheel. Cowboys, soldiers, and travelers alike depended on jerky for its lightweight, high-energy nutrition, a tradition that still holds up today, whether on a hiking trail or a long road trip. Despite the rise of freezers and preservatives, jerky hasn't lost its appeal. Artisanal butchers and home cooks are reviving traditional drying methods, using natural seasonings and slow dehydration techniques. In a world before timers, thermostats, and pressure cookers, people relied on one simple method to turn tough cuts of meat and hearty vegetables into rich, flavorful meals: slow cooking in a pot or cauldron. This technique has been used for centuries, from medieval stews bubbling over open fires to the French pot-au-feu simmering for hours. The idea was simple: let time and heat do the work. Before tender cuts of meat became widely available, tougher, cheaper cuts had to be softened through long, low-temperature cooking. Peasants, farmers, and travelers alike used heavy iron pots to transform scraps and bones into nourishing meals. Large cauldrons often sat over fires all day, feeding entire villages with stews that grew richer as new ingredients were added over time. Though the days of hanging cauldrons in open hearths have passed, slow cooking is far from obsolete. Modern slow cookers and Dutch ovens preserve this ancient tradition, offering a convenient way to make everything from pulled pork to beef stew. Home cooks and homesteaders alike value this method for its ability to maximize ingredients, reduce food waste, and bring out deep, complex flavors. Long before refrigeration made food storage effortless, people relied on the earth itself to keep their produce fresh: root cellaring. By harnessing the cool, stable temperatures underground, families could store potatoes, carrots, onions, and even apples for months without spoilage. In harsh winters when fresh food was scarce, a well-stocked root cellar meant the difference between thriving and barely scraping by. Root cellars weren't exclusive to one region. From the underground storage pits of indigenous tribes to the stone-lined cellars of early American homesteads, this method was a universal solution to food preservation. Some were dug directly into the ground, while others were built into hillsides or basements, taking advantage of natural insulation to regulate humidity and temperature. Today, as food prices rise and self-sufficiency gains traction, root cellaring is making a quiet comeback. Modern homesteaders and backyard gardeners are rediscovering this time-tested method, building everything from traditional in-ground storage pits to insulated basement pantries. Unlike a refrigerator, a root cellar requires no electricity, making it an energy-free, sustainable way to keep produce fresh long after harvest. For centuries, people have been harnessing the power of the earth itself to cook their food, cooking in underground pits. Long before metal ovens or stovetops existed, cultures across the world discovered that burying food with heated stones created a slow, even cooking process that locked in moisture and infused dishes with deep, smoky flavor. The technique was so effective that it has remained unchanged for thousands of years. From the Hawaiian imu used for roasting whole pigs to the Mexican barbacoa method of slow-cooking meat wrapped in agave leaves, underground cooking has played a central role in traditional feasts and celebrations. In New England, the clam bake, where seafood, corn, and potatoes are layered over hot stones and covered with seaweed, has been a summertime tradition for centuries. Across the Pacific, Maori hang pits produce tender, flavorful meats by letting steam do the work. Despite modern kitchen conveniences, underground cooking hasn't faded into history. Outdoor cooking enthusiasts and pitmasters still use these ancient techniques to create rich, fall-apart textures that no oven can replicate. Before refrigeration, there was one foolproof way to keep meat from spoiling: salt curing. This method, dating back thousands of years, was so essential that entire economies depended on it. The Romans used it to preserve fish for their legendary garum sauce, while sailors in the age of exploration packed barrels of salt-cured beef and pork to survive long voyages. Without salt, the world would have been a much hungrier place. The science behind it is simple. Salt draws out moisture, preventing bacteria from thriving. But beyond preservation, it also enhances flavor, deepens texture, and creates some of the most iconic foods in culinary history. From Italian prosciutto to Southern country ham, salt curing isn't just about making meat last, it's about making it taste even better. Even in the era of modern refrigeration, this tradition hasn't disappeared. Artisanal butchers, chefs, and home cooks still use salt curing to craft everything from lox to pancetta. The revival of old-school food preservation methods has brought this technique back into the spotlight, particularly among those looking to reduce food waste and rely less on artificial preservatives. Long before electric ovens and gas ranges, people relied on one powerful element to bake their bread: wood-fired ovens. Dating back to ancient civilizations like the Romans and Egyptians, these ovens were a cornerstone of communal baking, producing loaves with crisp golden crusts and soft, airy interiors. The secret? Radiant heat from the wood, which creates a unique cooking environment that no modern oven can quite replicate. This wasn't just about bread. From Italian pizza napolitana to Middle Eastern flatbreads, wood-fired ovens shaped culinary traditions around the world. In medieval Europe, entire villages shared large communal ovens, where families would bring their dough to bake for the week. Even today, certain styles of baking, like the French boulangerie tradition, still rely on wood-fired methods to produce their signature flavors. Despite the convenience of modern appliances, wood-fired ovens are making a resurgence. Artisan bakers and backyard enthusiasts alike are rediscovering the depth of flavor and rustic quality that only an open flame can provide. And in an era where sustainability is key, a wood-fired oven requires no electricity, just a steady supply of fuel and a little patience. Before pots and pans became kitchen staples, people mastered the art of cooking with nothing more than fire and stone, hot stone cooking. This ancient technique, used by cultures worldwide, relied on heated rocks to sear, steam, or boil food. Whether it was Pacific Islanders preparing seafood, indigenous North Americans making stews, or the Japanese perfecting ishiyaki, the method was simple but effective. Heat the stones, place the food on top, and let nature do the rest. Without metal cookware, early civilizations had to get creative, using river rocks and volcanic stones that could withstand extreme heat. Some even dropped red-hot stones directly into water-filled pits to bring liquids to a boil, a technique still practiced in certain traditional stews. The best part? No cleanup. When the meal was done, the stones simply returned to the earth, ready for the next use. Today, the tradition lives on in restaurants and outdoor cooking. From sizzling steak on hot slabs of granite to Peruvian pachamanca, where meats and vegetables are buried with hot stones, the method remains a symbol of simple, primal cooking. Before butter came neatly wrapped in a grocery store, people had to make it the old-fashioned way, butter churning. This practice dates back over 4,000 years, with early civilizations using animal skins, clay pots, or wooden barrels to separate butterfat from milk. It was a labor-intensive process, requiring patience, rhythm, and a whole lot of arm strength. In many households, especially on farms, churning butter was a daily task, turning fresh cream into a rich, golden staple. It preserved dairy in a time before refrigeration, added fat and flavor to cooking, and even served as a form of currency in some cultures. In medieval Europe, monasteries perfected the art of butter making, while in early America, families relied on wooden churns to keep their kitchens stocked. Even today, in places like Ireland and France, traditional hand-churned butter is still prized for its deep flavor and creamy texture. Though modern machines have taken over, butter churning hasn't disappeared entirely. Artisan dairies and homesteaders continue the practice, valuing the control it gives over ingredients and quality. And for those embracing self-sufficiency, making butter at home is as simple as cream, a jar, and a little elbow grease. For centuries, when nothing went to waste in the kitchen, people knew how to extract every bit of nutrition from their food, making bone broth. This slow-simmered liquid has been a staple across cultures, from Chinese medicinal soups to French fond de cuisine. Boiling animal bones for hours or even days released minerals, collagen, and deep, savory flavor, creating a broth that wasn't just warming, but packed with nutrients. Before mass food production, every part of an animal had to be used. Leftover bones from roasts, stews, or butchering were thrown into a pot with water, herbs, and vegetables, transforming scraps into liquid gold. In cold climates, a hearty broth helped sustain people through long winters, while in warmer regions, it formed the base for stews, sauces, and rice dishes. Despite the convenience of boxed stock today, homemade bone broth has made a major comeback. Health-conscious cooks swear by its gut-healing properties, and homesteaders appreciate its sustainability, turning what many consider waste into a nourishing staple. Whether it's a slow-cooked beef broth or a classic chicken stock, one thing remains true: good things come to those who simmer. Long before vegetable oils lined grocery store shelves, home cooks relied on lard and animal fats to fry, bake, and season their food. Rendered from pork, beef, or poultry, these natural fats were a kitchen staple for centuries, prized for their rich flavor, long shelf life, and ability to make everything, especially pie crusts, flaky and delicious. French chefs perfected confit, slow-cooking meats in their own fat. The British fried everything from potatoes to fish in beef tallow. In the American South, biscuits weren't biscuits without lard, and before margarine became widespread, butter and tallow kept food flavorful and satisfying. While the mid-20th century saw a decline in animal fats due to health concerns, science has since redeemed them. Unlike heavily processed oils, traditional fats like lard and tallow contain natural nutrients and lack the artificial additives of modern substitutes. Today, they're making a comeback in home kitchens and high-end restaurants alike, celebrated for their depth of flavor and natural cooking properties. After all, if lard was good enough for Grandma's fried chicken, it's probably worth keeping around. Before parchment paper and aluminum foil, nature provided the perfect cooking vessel, wrapping food in leaves. This technique, used for thousands of years, locks in moisture, infuses dishes with subtle earthy flavors, and even makes for a biodegradable, mess-free cooking method. From banana leaves in Asia to corn husks in Latin America, wrapping food wasn't just practical, it was an art. Many of the world's most beloved dishes rely on this method. In Mexico, tamales are wrapped in corn husks before steaming. Polynesian cultures slow-cook meats and fish in banana leaves buried underground for hours in imu pits. The Greeks have dolmas, grape leaves stuffed with rice and herbs. No matter the region, the concept remains the same: wrap, cook, and let the leaves do the work. Beyond flavor, leaf wrapping was a form of natural preservation. In humid climates, banana leaves acted as a barrier against spoilage. In tropical regions, palm leaves kept food fresh without refrigeration. Even today, this method remains popular among eco-conscious cooks looking to reduce waste. Modern chefs are rediscovering what ancient civilizations always knew: sometimes the best way to cook is to keep it simple. Before refrigeration, before canning, and long before preservatives filled ingredient lists, people turned to the most reliable food preserver of all: the sun. Sun-drying fruits and vegetables has been a practice for thousands of years, transforming fresh harvests into long-lasting, nutrient-dense staples. Ancient Egyptians dried dates and figs on rooftops, while Romans sun-dried grapes to make raisins, ensuring they had energy-packed food even when fresh produce was out of season. In Mediterranean climates, sun-dried tomatoes became a pantry essential, while in Asia, drying chilies and mushrooms ensured year-round flavor. Native American tribes dried berries for pemmican, a high-energy food that sustained hunters and travelers. The process was simple: slice, spread, and let the sun do its work. And with no need for fuel or electricity, it was as sustainable as it gets. Even today, sun-drying hasn't disappeared. Home gardeners, food preservers, and chefs still rely on this technique to intensify flavors and extend shelf life. Dehydrators may speed up the process, but nothing quite matches the taste of fruit dried by nature itself. Before spice racks were filled with neatly packaged bottles, people had to unlock flavor the hard way, grinding spices by hand. From ancient Egypt to medieval Europe, mortar and pestles, grinding stones, and hand mills were essential tools in every kitchen. Crushing whole spices released their natural oils, intensifying aroma and taste in a way pre-ground powders simply couldn't match. In India, fresh ground masalas transformed simple dishes into rich, layered meals. In Mexico, grinding chilies and cocoa beans on a molcajete created the foundation for complex sauces like mole. Across the Middle East, hand-ground spice blends like baharat and za'atar defined regional cuisine. No matter the culture, grinding spices was a ritual, a craft, and sometimes even a workout. Today, food processors and electric grinders have made the process faster, but many chefs and home cooks still swear by the old ways. Hand grinding allows for fresher flavors, a customizable texture, and, let's be honest, a little extra satisfaction knowing you've put in the effort. For those embracing self-sufficiency, it's also a way to connect with food on a deeper level. Long before commercial yeast and factory-made sodas, people relied on natural ferment starters to create everything from health-boosting tonics to intoxicating brews. For centuries, cultures across the world have harnessed wild yeasts and bacteria to produce drinks like kvass, kombucha, and mead, each with its own rich history and unique flavor. Kvass, a lightly fermented Slavic beverage made from rye bread, has been a staple in Eastern Europe for over 1,000 years, providing hydration and probiotics in one sip. Kombucha, which originated in China over 2,000 years ago, was often called the tea of immortality for its supposed health benefits. And mead? The world's oldest alcoholic drink, dating back to 7,000 BC, was once believed to be a gift from the gods, because what's better than fermented honey? These traditional brews weren't just about taste, they were about preservation, gut health, and self-sufficiency. By relying on wild fermentation, people could create naturally carbonated, probiotic-rich drinks without refrigeration or modern additives. Today, kombucha has become a billion-dollar industry, and home brewers are reviving the art of crafting small-batch ferments using the same techniques their ancestors did. Before refrigerators and freezers, people had to find a way to make food last. One of the most effective methods? water bath canning. This technique, which dates back to the early 1800s, allowed families to preserve fruits, vegetables, and even homemade sauces by sealing them in glass jars and processing them in boiling water. The result? Shelf-stable food that could last for months or even years without refrigeration. For homesteaders, pioneers, and wartime households, water bath canning wasn't just a convenience, it was a necessity. Summer's bounty of tomatoes, peaches, and berries was carefully packed into jars, ensuring a steady food supply through winter. The method became so essential that during World War II, the U.S. government encouraged home canning as part of the Victory Garden movement. Millions of Americans learned how to can at home, making the most of limited resources. While store-bought preserves eventually replaced much of home canning, the tradition never truly disappeared. Today, it's making a comeback, embraced by home cooks, gardeners, and anyone looking to cut down on food waste. Unlike commercial products loaded with preservatives, homemade canned goods rely on nothing but fresh ingredients, heat, and time. Before stainless steel ladles and plastic spatulas filled kitchen drawers, cooks had one trusted tool: wooden utensils. Used for centuries across nearly every culture, wooden spoons, paddles, and rolling pins were essential for stirring, mixing, and even shaping dough. Their durability, versatility, and natural resistance to heat made them indispensable in kitchens long before modern materials took over. Unlike metal, wood doesn't conduct heat, meaning you can stir a bubbling pot of stew without burning your hand. And unlike plastic, it won't melt if left resting on the side of a pan, a mistake most home cooks have learned the hard way. In cultures around the world, wooden utensils have played a vital role in traditional cooking. In Italy, wooden paddles shape pasta dough. In Japan, wooden rice paddles, shimoji, help keep grains fluffy. In Mexico, molinillos are used to whisk hot chocolate into a frothy delight. Despite the rise of high-tech kitchen gadgets, wooden utensils have never truly gone out of style. Professional chefs and home cooks still reach for them, valuing their gentle touch on cookware and the way they develop a rich patina over time. For thousands of years, people have relied on stone oven roasting to create some of the world's most iconic dishes. Whether it's an Indian tandoor, a rustic brick oven, or an open-air clay pit, these traditional cooking methods have been turning out smoky, fire-kissed flavors long before modern ovens existed. The secret lies in the intense, even heat that radiates from the thick stone walls. In the Middle East and South Asia, tandoors reach scorching temperatures, baking naan in seconds while producing perfectly charred meats. In Europe, brick ovens have been the backbone of bread making, with bakeries crafting crusty loaves and slow-roasted meats for centuries. And in Mexico, earth ovens called hornos have long been used to roast everything from corn to barbacoa. Beyond flavor, stone oven roasting was about efficiency. These ovens retained heat for hours, making them perfect for cooking large meals with minimal fuel. Entire villages in medieval Europe would bake their bread in communal ovens, a tradition that still survives in some rural areas. Even today, artisan bakers and pizza makers swear by stone ovens for their ability to create that unmistakable crispy yet chewy crust. For over 7,000 years, people have been transforming milk into something richer, longer-lasting, and infinitely more delicious: cheese. What started as a simple way to preserve dairy became one of the world's most beloved foods, with every culture putting its own spin on the craft. From the aged wheels of Parmigiano Reggiano in Italy to the creamy brie of France and the crumbly queso fresco of Latin America, cheesemaking is both an art and a science. Early cheesemaking was likely discovered by accident when milk stored in animal stomachs curdled due to natural rennet. But once humans realized what they had, they perfected the process, using salt, aging techniques, and different bacterial cultures to create countless varieties. In medieval Europe, monasteries became the great cheese laboratories, producing recipes that still define global cuisine today. Even in ancient Egypt, murals depicted cheesemaking as an essential part of daily life. While industrial production has made cheese widely available, traditional cheesemaking is far from forgotten. Artisan creameries, homesteaders, and food enthusiasts are reviving old techniques, creating small batch cheeses with rich, complex flavors that mass production simply can't replicate. Long before coffee dominated morning routines, people turned to herbal teas and infusions for both comfort and healing. From the ancient Egyptians steeping hibiscus to the Chinese perfecting green tea over 4,000 years ago, brewing plants, roots, and flowers in hot water was one of the earliest forms of medicine, and one of the simplest. Herbal infusions weren't just for enjoyment. They played a crucial role in daily health. Chamomile soothed the nerves, peppermint aided digestion, and ginger helped fight colds. In medieval Europe, monasteries cultivated herb gardens specifically for brewing medicinal teas, while indigenous tribes across the Americas relied on wild plants like echinacea and sassafras for their healing properties. Despite the rise of mass-produced tea bags, the tradition of brewing fresh herbs hasn't faded. Wellness trends have brought herbal teas back into the spotlight, with many rediscovering the benefits of loose-leaf blends and homemade infusions. Even science has backed up what ancient cultures already knew. Certain herbal teas contain compounds that reduce inflammation, boost immunity, and promote relaxation. Before cooking oils lined supermarket shelves, people relied on boiling and rendering animal fat for tallow and lard. This age-old practice not only provided a stable cooking fat, but also ensured that no part of an animal went to waste. For centuries, kitchens across the world used rendered fats to fry, bake, and preserve food, long before the rise of vegetable oils. In Europe, beef tallow was a prized ingredient for everything from deep-frying fish to making pastry dough. Lard, rendered from pork fat, was essential in American frontier cooking. Flaky biscuits, rich gravies, and even soap-making depended on it. In some cultures, rendered fat wasn't just for food. It was used for making candles, waterproofing leather, and even as an early form of skincare. With the introduction of processed oils in the 20th century, animal fats fell out of favor. But today, they're making a comeback, with chefs and home cooks embracing tallow and lard for their superior cooking properties and clean, natural origins. Unlike many modern oils, these fats are free from industrial processing and additives. Beaver tail was not just a meal to trappers and pioneers of the frontier, but a delicacy. This unusual dish was often served at celebratory feasts for its high fat content and rubbery texture. Beaver tail was more than a meal. In a time when calories were scarce and winters were unforgiving, it was survival on a plate. In itself, the preparation of beaver tail was a spectacle. The meat was fatty and gelatinous, and the scaly skin was blistered over an open flame until it could be peeled away. This meat was then roasted or boiled and sometimes seasoned with whatever herbs or spices settlers had on hand. The end result was a savory, rich dish that offered much-needed energy to trappers who braved the wilderness. These feasts were communal, bringing families and neighbors to share in the fruits of a successful trapping season. Beaver tail became a symbol of the frontier spirit, rugged, resourceful, and a bit eccentric. Beaver tail fell out of favor as modern food options expanded and the fur trade declined, becoming more of a historical curiosity than a culinary staple. Today, it's remembered as a quirky chapter in American food history, a dish that tells the story of the ingenuity and endurance of those who tamed the wild. Salmagundi is this really old English-American dish that basically predates even modern salads. It was originally made as this multi-layered petri dish of different kinds of meats, seafood, and eggs along with pickled vegetables, but it really started to take off as a dish that the wealthy would enjoy. Now, if some of you come from money, maybe you've ever heard of this being passed down in the family cookbooks. The other audience Salmagundi found a loving and comfortable home for itself in were ship crews, and the many different kinds of varieties of this they would make. Salmagundi's taste was something that was never ever set in stone. Basically, it's a lot like a hot pot, where gathering the ingredients for the dish, assembling it all, and preparing it is just as vital to the experience as eating it is. And just like hot pot, depending on what you pick for your salmagundi, you could end up with anything from a herbaceous stew with nothing but parsley and tarragon taking over your mouth to a soft and creamy, slightly eggy oceanic stew. It was really a lot of things, but one thing salmagundi never was: boring. This was a dish that had the potential to entertain you for years and years. A part of the joy of those meals was stuffing your mouth full with hand-strung popcorn garlands, which were just the easiest and crunchiest little decoration. Something that would put you in the festive spirit right away. All they took were some pretty simple things. If you had a bit of thread and some needles lying around, you could fix up some garlands in a sec. Today, even seeing something like needles and threads is rare in homes, what with all the sales and shopping at the malls, but back then people would still have items like that in use. Some of that use was out-of-the-box crafty work like hand-strung popcorn garlands, and we have to say, they certainly do bring a smile to your face, would you not agree? Canned food was seemingly a fan favorite back in the day, as SpaghettiOs are the next forgotten lunch we want to bring back. Campbell Soup Company took notice of the popularity pasta was gaining as a lunch food in the 1960s and invented SpaghettiOs. Sold for cheap in supermarkets, the dish was a basic tomato sauce with circular pasta rings instead of spaghetti noodles. SpaghettiOs were convenient and budget-friendly. Thus, they rapidly became a lunch staple for many people who needed a quick meal. Parents preferred giving their children SpaghettiOs because they were less messy, and children enjoyed the circular shape. Eventually, SpaghettiOs became a forgotten lunch as newer, easy-to-make lunches, like Kraft macaroni and spaghetti came along. People simply did not enjoy the taste of canned spaghetti and moved on from the iconic SpaghettiOs. Burgoo is like the first potluck stew ever. You know, only using squirrel or raccoon or whatever neighbors brought. Culinary free-for-all. Burgoo festivals were where communities would contribute meats, vegetables, and spices to a massive pot, creating a stew as diverse as the people stirring it. It was a Depression-era tradition of making do with what you had. Leftover chicken? Toss it in. A wild rabbit or two? Why not? Burgoo was beautiful because it was adaptable. Recipes varied from town to town, but one thing was certain. To get the signature thick, hearty texture, the stew had to simmer for hours, sometimes days. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the camaraderie of sitting around the pot, swapping stories, and working together. Burgoo festivals were often fundraisers or social events and brought communities together over a bowl of mystery meat stew. Modern versions of burgoo keep to safer ingredients like beef and chicken, but the old-school burgoo embraced whatever the local hunters and farmers could scrounge up. The raccoon and squirrel may have left the menu, but burgoo festivals are a beloved tradition in parts of Kentucky and Illinois. They're a tribute to the creativity and resilience of past generations, and sometimes the best meals are the ones shared with neighbors. Red flannel hash is a really rustic dish that comes from some of the best and most familiar ingredients known to Americans. You have yourself all the typical classics here, man. We got corned beef, potatoes, and beets, so take your pick. It's definitely giving Southern this time around. Now, this dish has a lot of savory notes going on because the hash is packed with umami while the briny depth from the corned beef really contrasts it and makes a complex flavor profile. The cured and intense beefy flavor is something that only gets accentuated by the use of mustard seed and peppercorn. Sorry, did this turn into a food analysis channel? This was basically just old-school comfort food, and it was the type of thing your grandparents would come back to or make for each other with a lot of life. The first bite is perfect for savory lovers, but it keeps having something for everyone as you go along. Silver Christmas trees were something that not just the children, but literally everyone would look at with awe. A bright aluminum tree bringing light into the house and being a sight for everyone's sore eyes. With some homes that found that the trees really synced with their interior decor choices, it was an extremely important Christmas tradition. Some people just thought it looked better with the season and all the snow piled up outside rather than a big green tree. Silver Christmas trees are not something you see today anymore, their era has long passed, but in the 50s and 60s era, they were really trendy. Did you know these used to be the most purchased thing in a Sears catalog? Yeah, we know you might not know what the Sears catalog is, but it was a big deal back then, okay? Honestly, they did not look so bad, and we would not mind bringing them back for 2025's Christmas. Would you hang up one of these in your house, or is nature the best decoration for a cheery winter? Going back to hearty lunch meals, Pot roast is a family lunch that was made in homes using whichever ingredient was available at the time. Historically, pot roast can be traced back to Europe, where peasants and working-class homes regularly ate this lunch. Made using tougher cuts of meat and commonly available vegetables, America adopted this recipe as their own during the Great Depression. Economic perils allowed for pot roast to be a part of lunch tables, as people would use just about any vegetables and protein they could find. The most popular recipe was slow-cooked beef with carrots and potatoes topped with gravy. With the economic situation in the States improving, pot roast lost significant popularity amongst consumers as necessity was no longer something they had to factor into their cooking. Colonial Americans didn't just cast their votes, they cast oyster shells too. Election Day in the 18th and 19th centuries wasn't just a solemn civic duty, it was a full-blown party, with barrels of ale and mountains of oysters. Campaign rallies today can be raucous, but try thinking about a scene where voters slurped oysters and debated politics, often in the lively confines of a local tavern. Why oysters? They were cheap, plentiful, and easy to eat with one hand while holding a pint in the other. The tradition began in coastal towns where oysters were plentiful, but spread inland as transportation improved and oyster farms grew. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Candidates would sometimes pay to keep the oyster platters and the drinks flowing, a precursor to modern campaign spending, but with mollusks. After Election Day, streets were often littered with shells, looking like a seafood apocalypse. The feasts could be a symbol of unity, or they could be a demonstration of social divisions because only property-owning white men could participate in the feasts, or the voting. Elections grew more structured, oysters grew more expensive, and the oyster tradition faded. It is a fascinating reminder of a time when democracy and indulgence went hand in hand, and even the fight for representation could be deliciously messy. Pepper pot soup is a really nice soup. It has such strong ties to Philadelphia and the Caribbean cuisine that was once really popular there in the 20th century, and to be honest, still is. This was a recipe that was actually a favorite of the people during the Revolutionary War, and the reason for that was a little interesting bit of trivia. See, George Washington's troops, when they were stationed at Valley Forge, would famously eat a lot of pepper pot soup to the point where it became something of a local rumor. Now, the dish on its own has very little American roots, if any. It's a West African and Caribbean dish through and through. If I had to describe the experience of it in one way, it would be like constantly drinking liquid chili flakes, or like just drinking a much better version of instant ramen noodle broth. The thing is, each person's recipe was really unique to them. Overall, though, it was basically just a really complex dish that has a very distinctly peppery bite to it. It's never overwhelming, but it does linger in your mouth a lot. It's good that it's backed up by so many herbal spices to help keep that at bay, though, because otherwise I think it would get pretty old, pretty fast. People would not just hand someone a train set and call it a day after they came all that way. They would also pull out the best they had in regards to fine china and dressing. Got a gathering of literally everyone you know over the weekend? Paper plates would probably look pretty bad, so let's pull out the most fancy plates in the house. P.S. People would often find themselves pretty short-stacked of these plates, so shopping for them around that time of the year was higher too. Using some precious silver and setting up a very elaborate, thoughtful table was a love language for many. Nowadays, it is definitely regular for people to show up in something like that sweaty shirt they wore like half of the past week, or jeans. Back in the 1900s, towards the end at least, people would get suited up proper and come dressed for the occasion, especially with the children. Don't you ever remember being hounded by your mom about how you really need to nail this suit for Thanksgiving? Gotta keep up the family rep, right? Presently, it is definitely the more sensitive family that chooses to put that kind of effort in for the most joyous meals of the year. Our list of forgotten lunches would be incomplete without mentioning bean sandwiches. You may not have even heard of this vegetable-based take on sandwiches, but decades ago, bean sandwiches were part of many lunch tables. Home chefs preferred this healthy take on sandwiches even though cooking beans was a tedious task because you would end up with a flavorful and well-seasoned meal. According to the traditional recipe, the sandwich was cooked beans that were sometimes mashed and served on bread with toppings like vegetables and cheese. Like any other sandwich, the bean sandwich was highly customizable and satisfied just about anyone's cravings. If you had leftover beans from dinner, making a bean sandwich could be your best option. Since people were conscious of leftovers and wanted the most value out of all of their meals, bean sandwiches were a good way to utilize beans. Still, the combination was a little odd, and not a lot of states would pick up this lunch option. As meat delis opened up across the states, bean sandwiches were forgotten to be a thing of the past. A funeral without dessert? The answer for the Pennsylvania Dutch was a sticky, raisin-filled pie, funeral pie. This was not just food, but tradition, practicality, and a little comfort all wrapped up in a flaky crust. Raisins were cheap, easy to store, and didn't need refrigeration, which made them a good ingredient for a dish that was made in advance. Plus, their sweetness was a little theological sugar rush for mourners, symbolizing the hope of eternal life. The pie itself was straightforward, a filling of raisins, sugar, and spices, thickened with cornstarch or flour, and gooey. For the crust, simplicity was king. No fancy, no overly decorative, appropriate to the occasion. When baked, the pie became the centerpiece of post-funeral meals, offering comfort to grieving families. Funeral pie was melancholic in origin, but had a job to do, to feed large groups with few ingredients. While not everyone loved the pie, it was a hit. Practical but divisive, raisins were sticky sweet or repulsive to eaters. The dish became less common over time as more varied dessert options became available. Funeral pie is a relic of the past, baked today by those who are enthusiasts of Pennsylvania Dutch culture. It remains a fascinating reminder of how food traditions are interwoven with the most universal moments of life: grief and remembrance. Potato candy might sound like one of the most genuinely confusing things ever to you, but it's as real as it gets. Potato candy is a very nostalgic confection that originated somewhere in the Appalachia a very long time ago, but it got picked up by the Pennsylvania Dutch communities in the early parts of the 20th century. It was a Depression-era recipe that was just made with mashed potatoes instead of any other kinds of expensive ingredients. You had your nuts and butter, but that was it. Most of the famous versions of this dish just consist of sugary and soft potato-based dough that's been soaked in peanut butter. What does stand out about this dish is the unique pinwheel shape that it has, though. It works out surprisingly well for this dish because the potato itself actually doesn't have a lot of flavor once it gets mixed in with the powdered sugar. It has a starchy undertone, but that's mostly it. Your first most prominent tastes are going to be a strong splash of vanilla and a warm bakery-like fragrance created by the peanut butter, sugary dough, and the extract. It's about as hard as you would expect a potato candy to be, but it's also way better than you would give it credit. I don't know, I think I might make this one a regular in my kitchen. What about you? Cardboard fireplaces were something that were also extremely common in the 60s and 70s, like aluminum trees and club accounts, but these have a bit more of a vintage touch. Hey, we really do mean that. Remember the Sears catalog? Yeah, this was a heavy hitter too. A very brief tradition. For houses that did not have a hearth or fireplace, this was the ideal purchase for wintertime. Everyone wants to bask in the feeling of some warmth by the fireplace, and the better it looks, the more relaxed you feel. What about if you live in an apartment or a place with poor ventilation, or if you just do not like soot and gas and all that? Does that mean you still cannot indulge in some heat-based fun around Christmas like everyone else? It is exactly for people like that, and for cravings like those, that the cardboard fireplaces were invented. Their time had passed by the 80s, but they were just a really nifty and stylish choice for your holiday decor plans. Adding this to a home added some celebrative spirit to it, and God knows we could always do with more of that. You might be familiar with bologna because of its popularity as a deli meat today, but fried bologna sandwiches were in a league of their own back in the 1960s. Categorized as a Southern classic, fried bologna sandwich was brought into the USA by German immigrants. The sandwich was mostly popular as a school lunch, as cafeterias would serve up hot fried bologna slices on bread with cheese to students during lunch hour. While school lunches had a reputation for being average food, the fried bologna sandwich was exempted from such notions. Children loved when fried bologna was on the school cafeteria menu, and parents were happy that their children were finally content with their school lunches. Fried bologna sandwiches remained a popular lunch choice until schools shifted to foods that could be cooked in batches instead of sandwiches that had to be individually assembled. Today, turkey may reign supreme, but eels slithered their way onto Thanksgiving menus in early New England. Eel stew was as traditional as pumpkin pie was back then, thanks to the resourcefulness of Native Americans who taught settlers how to cook these slimy but protein-rich fish. Eel harvesting was not an easy business, but in order to eat eel, colonists relied on techniques learned from indigenous peoples who had been doing the same thing for centuries, using either woven baskets or dug eel traps in the mud. The eels were caught and skinned, gutted, and simmered into a stew with root vegetables, herbs, and whatever else the settlers had been able to grow or gather. The outcome was a hearty, savory dish that fed hungry colonists through their first harsh winters. Not only were eels plentiful, but their high-fat content made them an important source of energy. Also, they were easy to preserve with smoking or salting and could be stored for months. But eel stew eventually fell out of favor on Thanksgiving tables as the holiday evolved, and it is a fascinating window into the early American diet. Recreating it today would be fun if you're feeling adventurous, but don't be surprised if your guests politely decline in favor of turkey and stuffing. Bavarian-style fried dough, or otherwise known as knee pastries and kniekekel, is as close as Germans are ever getting to proper doughnuts, I think. I'm just kidding. It was something that was introduced way back when German immigrants had first started pouring into America, including a lot of the people that would come to make up the Pennsylvania Dutch. Now there's some history with your food. The name for it actually comes from a method of stretching dough that's traditional for German cooks, but was foreign to American kitchens. They would stretch the dough over the knee of the baker before they fried it, and while you might think this does absolutely nothing, and while initially I may have been inclined to agree with you, this actually does do a lot. It makes this very puffy center that has wonderfully crispy edges that really help support the dish. A crispy and pillowy texture helps because the warmth and richness of it feels all the more better thanks to that. The first bite usually breaks those edges apart, and that gives way to the beautiful center, so this dish is a delight for your senses as much as it is for your taste buds. What your grandparents probably did if they were into baking or lived around areas where the Pennsylvania Dutch were present was coat it with jam, which would really help give it a lot more depth and just make the dish more refreshing overall. Another way that fire helped people have more fun during the holidays were Yule logs. Nothing like setting up a nice big Yule log and hanging it up as a centerpiece. Yule logs were a preferred decoration for many people who wanted to get their home looking festive and warm. You could put the log just about anywhere because it worked great next to fireplaces, could work as candle holders if you drilled some holes into them, and were just something people always associated with Christmas. Seeing a red ribbon-tied Yule log really puts it into your head that the time of Santa Claus is here. Yule logs looked great, and that definitely helped them be as popular as they were, bless the white birch. It was a standard tradition to share a whole gallon of eggnog in the backyard around a burning Yule log or by the hearth. Many heartfelt conversations and fond family memories were made this way. For what it is worth, the eco-friendly homes of today are definitely much healthier and safer, but maybe a fire once or twice would not hurt. Corned beef hash with eggs was popularized in the States after World War II when rationing meat was a common practice. One of state's biggest food processing companies, the Herbal company, claims they bought corned beef hash to America in the 1950s and jump-started the invention of corned beef hash recipes. Since acquiring fresh meat was getting harder in the post-war era, people used corned beef to create a hash lunch. The recipe was simple. All you had to do was dice corned beef, mix it with potatoes and onions, then add a poached or fried egg on top. Corned beef was not really a fan favorite as the peculiar taste did not appeal to many people. This meant that as soon as necessity was not driving people's cooking, they forgot all about corned beef hash with eggs. Imagine a world where you woke up in the morning and dinner was dependent on the kindness of strangers and whatever scraps you could find. Hobo stew camps were exactly that. a gathering of desperate people who pooled together what little money they had and ingredients to make a communal meal. Hobos found temporary shelter, and these makeshift soup kitchens sprang up along train tracks, in shanty towns, wherever hobos found temporary shelter. Hobo stew was as unpredictable as the people who made it, and the recipe for it was just as random. Perhaps one day it will consist of a can of beans, an onion, and a single carrot. Someone else may contribute a chunk of bacon or a handful of rice, another day. Everyone had thrown whatever they could scavenge into the large pot that had been cooked over an open fire. The meal was often hodgepodge, but it was usually surprisingly tasty and always filling, a miracle considering the circumstances. These camps weren't just about food. It had everything to do with community, solidarity, and survival. Even if only temporarily, spirits were lifted, stories were shared, and friendships were forged around the stew pot. Though the need for such camps has long passed, the memory of hobo stew still serves as a powerful symbol of human resilience and the enduring spirit of sharing when times are hard. Mock turtle soup is a soup that first made its way to American shores all the way from 18th century England, and while some people initially thought it should have stayed there, enough people warmed up to it. Well, at least enough for us to be able to say this was a common recipe among our grandparents. Now, turtle was never really something that was going to be popular with the American people right from the get-go, but it was in the deepest pits of the Depression that people found the room in their heart to put aside their mortal differences and finally focus on the real problem: hunger. Not borrowing from our European rivals. No, hunger. And this was a dish that did a phenomenal job of keeping that at bay. It had an incredibly deep and beefy richness to it because the base of the turtle soup was just a lot of broth, right? Broth that had been stewing in collagen for quite a while, absorbing all the flavors from the meat. It was a deeply comforting experience according to some old recipes and references, but I'm still not sure about trying it today. Remember how we just talked about people going to brick-and-mortar joints to purchase some holiday train sets? You might think, why a train set of all things? Well, nowadays you might bring your kid newer games like Red Dead Redemption or the new Tekken, but back then a common present under your Christmas tree would be a good old train set. Yes, the ones with seemingly thousands of pieces that would take hours and hours to put together. Seems like a tacky gift today, right? You would want to go for something relaxing or immediately enjoyable, but see, not only were holiday train sets more popular ages ago, but so was travel by trains. In fact, most people would have to take trains to visit family during holiday seasons. Asking for time off from work because you had to catch two-way trains was a pretty valid excuse. And let's be real, those winter rides could get boring at best and lonely at worst. So to make it a little better as an acknowledgement of the distance someone had to bear to come see them, people loved holiday train sets. We think it is a pretty cute little story, and definitely a thoughtful gift even though we would never put one together if someone gifted one. Fast food gained a lot of popularity in America during the 1940s, so it is not surprising that chili cheese dogs are next on our list. Hot dogs topped with homemade chili and melted cheese were sold at just about every roadside cart to people looking for a quick lunch. Best for workers who had short breaks, chili cheese dogs were the perfect balance of spices and flavors that would satisfy their hunger. In fact, the common man took such a liking to these hot dogs that several variations of a chili cheese dog recipe was released to the public in cooking sections of the daily newspaper. Soon after, chili cheese dogs were a comfort lunch served at family tables, with each house adding whichever toppings they preferred. You will not see this food served during family lunches anymore because hot dogs today are reduced to their value as being a roadside food. Ash cakes weren't just survival food. They were a quiet act of resistance and a deeply symbolic tradition for enslaved communities. Baked directly in the ashes of a fire, these simple cornmeal cakes turned the most basic of ingredients into a source of sustenance and strength. It was a simple process, deceptively so. If they had cornmeal, water, and salt, they shaped the mixture into patties and dropped them right into the glowing embers of a fire. The cakes were cooked till firm, and the ashes brushed off before eating. Ash cakes, though humble in preparation, gave grueling days of labor much-needed energy. Ash cakes were not only practical, but they carried immense cultural significance. Stories were passed down, and traditions were preserved, and they were often shared during communal meals, spiritual gatherings, or clandestine meetings. At these moments, the ash cake was more than just food, it was a bond to a common heritage and a representation of strength. Ash cakes are a simple dish that has been echoed in modern cooking, with some chefs recreating their own versions of the dish. It's a sobering reminder of the ingenuity that comes from oppression, but their origin story. Fire-baked ash cakes, but fire also forged them. The unquenchable spirit of the one who made them turned nothing into something that fed body and soul alike. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe and let me know if you learned something new in the comments below.